All right, welcome back. It's been a little bit longer than I expected, been a little busy. But we're gonna do some more here with Kotlin and Micronaut, and we're gonna jump right back into where we were. So in the previous stream, we were essentially having some issues. The copy paste job that I've done from a previous project and kind of how I like to set up Docker files and use DrCompose for testing wasn't going to work. So essentially what we've got, and I'll recap here real quick, right? We wrote a quick, basically hello world test, right? It's an integration test. It spins up a server, uses an HTTP client, calls our server, and then responds with hello. And so this test run, and this test runs and works in the IDE as expected. But what we want is I typically like to set up some sort of completely isolated environment. Typically you'll do this with the CI or CD server. And one of the ways that I like to do that is I like to have basically an identical environment to the CI CD server. And I do that using Docker and DrCompose. Oh yeah, we got to also start up our database here. We want another tab there. So if we have our makefile, and if we do docker compose -f docker compose -dev up, this will bring up our database. And if we run our test, this should work, right? So this is a perfect example of why I like to set this up, because then you don't really have to worry about like running all of the dependencies on your machine. The goal is to be able to basically just run, make test, have DrCompose spin up any of your dependencies and things like that, as well as your app server, and run all of your tests, usually, hopefully, more integration tests, or as many as you can, in kind of an isolated environment. So where we last left off is we had built this Dockerfile test Docker container, and what this does is it just copies over the folder into the container, puts you in the root, does some permissions things, and then puts you in the root work folder. Now, I've done this many times on a lot of different projects. I've essentially kind of used this structure all over the place, and I was having trouble getting this to work. And basically I'll show you what was happening is that if I run make test, everything would build and it would run, but for whatever reason, I couldn't figure out why there was nothing in here. So initially I was like, oh, maybe this is WSL2, right? So this is a new kind of Windows machine. I've been playing around with, WSL2 and containers and all of that kind of stuff. Normally I run on a Mac. So I was kind of thinking it was that, and one of the viewers pointed out to me that I was simply missing a slash. And so you'll see now, if we run this, there will actually be stuff in our folder, and it will attempt to run. It looks like we'll still have to fix some issues. Yeah, again, this is I guess the joys and pains of programming, right? You do things tons and tons of times. No matter how many times you do it, you'll still always run into something. You'll do something wrong, and again, it can all boil down to literally just missing a slash. So thank you to the viewer or the watcher that pointed that out. And now we're back to where we started. So now we can actually go ahead and see if we can continue on and fix these tests. So we're going to go ahead and remove some of the debugging stuff that we had put in here. And again, what we ideally want is when we run make test for the Docker containers to spin up, to run and for those tests to be completed in a separate environment. And it looks like we're still getting some sort of issue here. So IO exception permission denied. So let's see what it's trying to do. Could not calculate current default timestamp. So one thing here that could be the problem is that when we run, and as you should, when you run, or when we copied everything over into the Gradle file, into the Gradle base Docker image, everything runs as a separate user, so not a root user, the Gradle user. And so I suspect that there is maybe some file that it's trying to create or touch or whatever, and it's maybe doing it in a spot where it can't or something like that, and we just need to figure out why that is. So let's take a look more at this and see if we can figure out what is doing this. So permission denied. This is a new one, so let's take a look. Permission denied. The question is that I don't necessarily know where it's trying to do this, so it's a little interesting. Yep, I've already done this. I have ownership. But maybe we something up here. So we create the folder. Oh, we switch. Well, no, we say own it here. But if you add, oh, that's interesting. You can do add, and copy also supports it. Okay, so we shouldn't have to do this. And I guess we probably don't even have to do that, so we can simplify it even more. So basically we are adding it. And we're in the root folder. All right, that shouldn't have fixed it, right? So failed to create parent directory in here. So it still doesn't have yet. Okay, so it still doesn't have full capabilities in that folder. And it should. I mean, I guess we don't even need this. I also don't even need this, I guess. That's still probably not going to fix it, but let's just keep doing less and less commands and simplify it. That's always a good thing. So that did do something. Because now it's not even running. So what did we... Maybe it's the user. Stop these. Yeah, okay. Unable to create daemon log file, file not found. Yeah, so it's trying to basically put something in the home Gradle, which that ain't gonna work. Well, in theory it should, I guess. What is this saying to do? All right. Maybe it's just that. No. Permission denied. Could not calculate current default timestamp. Yeah, okay. So it looks like the permissions thing is just not doing it. I mean, this shouldn't matter either, because it should just be that user. Right. Just back to the same thing. Could not calculate current timestamp. Huh. It's funny it comes back to here every time. Sets a user Gradle. Files you're copying from your app directory to Docker images app directory may not have the right permissions for Gradle user. Run the chmod is not working because that command is being run again as Gradle inside the context. You have to run that. What is this copy dash dash from 0? What? Well, that's interesting. We're gonna have to look that up and see if that's really what's doing it. Well, but all right, let's just do it in the order that this guy does it. But this is a little interesting. So copies from here over. Then he sets himself as root, and then he runs this. On the root folder. Sets the user to Gradle, and then he runs it. But that's the same thing that I was doing. Yeah, this. Yeah, that's the same thing I was doing. Okay. So we could, in theory, ignore this issue and just run everything as root, but that wouldn't be the best thing to do. Copy also supports chown. User and group. Source and destination. Only on Docker files used to build Linux containers and will not work on Windows containers. don't think that applies. Well, actually, let's yeah. So we could just set it to run as root, but as I said, that's not the best thing in the world, but it's running. So let's just see if this spins up and runs, and if it does, then we can go back to fixing our permissions issues. Nope, that didn't work either. Execution failed. Initialization error failed. Yeah, okay, so it can't connect to the database. That's fine. Okay, we can fix that problem later. Let's fix this Docker permissions issue. All right, so again, we want to run as a non-privileged user. And this should have the right permissions, but it clearly doesn't. But this is Gradle. Actually, I'm wondering if there's something with DrCompose. Yeah. What is there? Yeah, okay. Maybe that's the problem. Or maybe it, yeah. Okay, so that's a different error now. Oh, no. Permission denied, Gradle. Yeah. Okay. Well, that definitely did something different, so maybe that is really our issue. So there's definitely a permissions problem here. Bom. This is really quite strange. From Gradle. Doesn't really matter where this is. I mean, this shouldn't matter either. That shouldn't matter. Take it from a certain spot, copy it over to there, and then run. Mike, you're not allowed to talk about Bitcoin. The first thing about Bitcoin is to not talk about Bitcoin. Gradle cannot start your build. Man, I still don't have permissions. Okay. What if this is the home directory? Oh, it's not gonna like that. There's got to be something going on with this thing. Change your user to root. Yeah, that's not what we're gonna do. Yeah, okay, so let's do this. Let's change this to here. Let's just put it in there. And see what happens. Nope. Man. What the heck? Gradle permission denied. I mean, maybe it's something that, maybe it's that? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Test. Okay. Line by line, all the parameters. Same freaking problem. Okay, I give up. We're running it as root because it's test and it don't matter. It's gonna run as root because I'm annoyed and want to move on from this. That's kind of crazy. I don't know why that doesn't work. It should just work just fine. Okay, so this is gonna run now and test is gonna fail because can't connect to the database. So why is that? So that's because when you, in DrCompose, this is the name of the actual database. So when you call it, you can't use localhost, and you'll see we've got you know, application.properties, and we call localhost. So that's not going to work. So what we can do is we can set a different properties file for testing. And I'm guessing there's a special way to do this for testing, and we just gotta remember how to do it. Application specific. So I'll bet you there is a test one. So we're gonna do this. We're gonna copy this application-test. Change this to Postgres. And let's see. convention is to search for a file called application. The system properties environment variables when creating an application context. So let's check what environment runs when you run test. So if this picks it up, then that means it automatically sets the environment to test when you run a test, but if it doesn't, it'll break. Yeah, okay, so that didn't pick it up or didn't change. Oh, actually, you know what? It did change. Yeah, okay, so that may be all we have to do. I wish it gave the URL that it was trying to connect to so that I could confirm. Yeah, unknown host Postgres. Okay, so when you run a test, it looks for application test.properties. So in this case, it will look for this file, and if we name this Postgres, because that's what, again, is in our DrCompose file, right? So in our DrCompose test setup, our database is named Postgres. This is the host name of that container. That will work. So let's go ahead and rerun our tests. And if all goes well, we should have what we want. It's interesting, this is actually pretty slow, or slower than I expected. Especially because I have a pretty fast computer, but it is going through quite a bit of translation. So yeah, there we go. Tests all passed. Everything looks good, connected to the database. And here I'll show you, right, because it's always good to, well, we already were failing our tests and then we made our test pass, so that's good, so we know that we're running. But now we will, I'll do it the other way, right? I just changed the database host name, right, in the DrCompose file to Postgres-test, and now this is going to fail because it's not going to be able to connect. So just to prove that there's no funny business here. So there you go. Failing tests. Unable to connect. Bean instantiation. So there you go. So we have our tests working. Hooray, hooray. And now, one thing I would like to do is, when you run the test command, I think that there's a way to get nicer outputs. I wonder how to do that. Is there a way to give you display test results in real time? Yeah, there we go. -I. Gradle test -I. So this will give us nice, you know, if you've ever used Node or Go or any of those, right, this will actually give you the test coverage information in line as you're going, with a whole bunch of other junk. So we want to, maybe we don't want that. -I probably turns on a whole bunch of stuff we don't want. Yeah, -I will give you a bunch of irrelevant stuff. I don't want any of that. I want something like this, Gradle test logger plugin. This requires a plugin? Okay, that's kind of lame. We won't do that. All right. So now, so this is great. So our tests are now working. So we can now run full integration tests. Spins up a little server, hits our endpoint, and now we're in pretty good shape. So next thing we're going to do is let's write a real endpoint against kind of this GraphQL endpoint here. Or actually, maybe we just now have to write our first GraphQL endpoint, and we will go from there. So we talked a little bit about this. We started writing this schema. We created some migration files to put those in here. We're not going to hook those up just quite yet in terms of connecting the database, but now we're just going to do GraphQL. So let's go to the documentation here. So we'll basically just write a quick endpoint or two or queries that return essentially just some dummy information, right? So the query object in GraphQL is a special type. And so then basically we have to wire up these resolvers here so that they work. And let's go ahead and take a look. We'll do just a quick introduction to this. So in GraphQL, query is a special type. So you'll see we've defined two types here. There is a special type called query. And that's basically how you define kind of your entry points into the system. So let's go ahead and yeah, here we go. So type query. And so typically, or one of the things that we could do, and we'll probably do this first, is you'll see here from the docs, there's like this me query. And so this me query will typically return a user. And we don't have a user yet, but we will do that just to show this. Actually, let's just do this. So we're going to always want to be able to query for all of our accounts, right? So we've already created this. And there's going to be essentially a list of accounts. And I'm annotating this because we're always going to return a list. And if there aren't any accounts, we'll return an empty list rather than null. I'd like to try and drive out null from the code base wherever you can. And basically one of the reasons for that is, or there's a couple reasons, but if you are calling a function and it looks like this, right? If you call this function, right, and then you want to actually operate on it, in Kotlin, there's a way to kind of do this a little easier with this, but I tend not to like that, right? If there is a way for you to return kind of an empty thing, and basically that just lets me do, right? And a lot of times in older code bases, right, you'll see like if v does not equal null and v dot, you know, or not v dot is empty, right, or is blank or whatever, right? And so before we had, you know, these nice extension functions and nullability, right, this could drive all sorts of weird stuff in your code base. So I tend to prefer to not do this, and that way you never have to do this null check. And so then whenever you're going to operate on something, you only have to check like, is it empty? And so then it's the same pattern for a string or an array or whatever that is, right? So I tend to try to not use null wherever I can for strings, particularly for strings and arrays. So we're going to return basically an empty array of accounts if there aren't any. And so let's go ahead and wire up that query. And we will make a new package here. GraphQL. And we will do as one does. We'll create a factory, just like this says. And okay, so this is where we are going to wire up the GraphQL stuff. And we're not going to take in any data fetchers, and we're just going to return basically a GraphQL instance. Okay. So what are we doing here? We're doing a couple things. First, we're going to parse. First, we're going to parse this schema. Okay. So we are going to create a parser, right? The next thing that we're going to do is we are essentially going to generate an executable schema for kind of the GraphQL runtime. And we'll call this generator. And then finally, we basically take new GraphQL, and we give it basically the schema, and then we call build. Now there's a couple steps in between here though. So the first thing, the two things that we have to tell the runtime or kind of combine together is essentially a type definitions. So we have to tell it about the types, and then we have to basically wire in how GraphQL should fetch these things. So everything in GraphQL is, this is a field. And so this is a field on the query type. And so you'll see here, we are going to wire up a runtime wiring that says when someone queries for accounts, run this function. And from there, it's essentially turtles all the way down. So when we define a type or a data fetcher for transaction and account and those things, you can have individual fetchers for each of these. So maybe your couple of your fields came from one place and a couple of your fields came from another. GraphQL will look at all of that and optimize that and transparently grab all that information. So it's really great if you have multiple sources of data. We can kind of coalesce all of that together for you. So we are going to do a initial runtime wiring for query type when someone calls accounts. So let's go ahead and do that. So we are going to have a type registry, right? And we are going to merge parser.parse and this is the wonderful world of file I/O in Java. Get resources stream class path schema.graphqls. That's what we called it, right? Yep. .get. Java and file I/O, you still suck. When will you ever get better? Probably never. Okay. So what we've basically said is hey, type registry, this is one of the files that you can get your types from. So this type definition registry will read this file and it will go, I know about all these types now. And you can split your schemas over multiple files. So as this gets bigger, we probably will do that. Basically, we loaded this up into our type registry. So from there, we now have to create what's called a runtime wiring, right? So we have to tell GraphQL, here's all the functions that you run to grab data. And we're going to do this manually, but there is a really cool project from the Expedia team, I think, that makes this annotation based, which is pretty cool, and we might get into that. But we're just going to do this manually. And, you know, we're going to use the nice little Kotlin DSL. Okay, so we're going to take in a type wiring. And here is where we are going to wire in our function. Type wiring dot data fetcher. Data fetcher is what they are called in the Java GraphQL framework. Our field, again, is accounts. So we're going to say on query, there is a data fetcher that you call when someone calls accounts. And then again, it's expecting a thing here. So what we're going to do is just define, and data fetcher is just an interface. And so we are going to define a function, get accounts. And again, we are just doing this by this to demonstrate this for now. We will clean this up later. This will return a list of accounts. Oops, no, this is not what I want to do. I need to create, sorry, class get accounts fetcher, data fetcher, this is how to get accounts. Yep. Actually, you know, this will return a list of accounts. And then we can go ahead, implement the members, right? So we have to provide a get function, and then we'll return a list of accounts. So we're just going to return empty list for now. And then we will say use accounts fetcher, this instance, and we will generate our schema, generator.make executable schema, and we'll give it our type registry, so all of our types, and then our runtime wiring. All right, so that's the last thing. We will pass this schema over and we will build. All right. So this should be enough to query. So we're going to put some breakpoints in here to show you how this is running, and then we will also test out the Query Explorer. So let's go ahead and run this. Let's see if we have any issues. Oh, yeah, that's just the silly thing there. Connect localhost. Is my database not running anymore? Yep, it's not running anymore. All right, let's pick this back up. Okay, database is up to date. We are all set. What we are going to do now is we're going to open up our /GraphQL. Actually, I don't know if we enabled this. We may not have. Yeah. Okay. So what we want to do is enable GraphQL and set the path. And now we can yes, so what we want to do is we want to enable graphical. So that's the next thing that we're going to do. Oh, actually, that's the graphical path. Maybe that's not what we want. No. We want that. Then we're going to configure graphical. All right, so graphical is kind of a built-in query documentation browser thing in here. So we're going to enable this as true. We're going to set the path to graphical. No template or anything like that. Don't care about customization. Okay, so let's rerun this. And okay, so now if we go to localhost 8080/graphical, yep, that didn't work. We should see graphical, but we don't. So why not? Unexpected error occurred. No such method error. Default property placeholder, blah, blah, blah. Weird. That looks like a weird Gradle issue. That's quite strange. Let's run that again. Nope, same problem. Internal server or default property placeholder from graphical controller. Okay, so this is something going on with Micronaut. Micronaut GraphQL comes bundled with graphical, so that's good. Okay, maybe we have to set the rest of these. It's kind of weird, but I guess we will do that. Doesn't really make any sense, but we'll give it a shot. Nope. Did I mean that? Sure. Pendency issue? Seems a little weird, but let's take a look. Well, that's no fun. (1.2.2) Micronaut inject 2.0 M3. That's no good. That can't be right. Clean? A little nervous about this thing being a different version, but can't see why that would be a problem. But maybe. No, I don't want clean. I want to run the API. Still nothing. Weird. Verify every module. Fix this in the upcoming 1.3 release. Ooh, okay, so maybe Maven Central v13. Okay, so yeah, dependency issue. 1.3.0. See if Gradle pulls that down. Yep. Sure did. Nope, that didn't work. Micronaut above requires core. Micronaut on core. Micronaut version. Okay, let's check the Micronaut version. Maybe we should just update everything. Actually, Micronaut just released version 2.0, right? Didn't they? Generator project 2.0.0. Aha. Let's download all the goodness and see what we get. This is broken. I'm going to be upset. This shouldn't be broken though. I think it's just a version issue. Add example of data loader. Yeah, we already know how to do that. Support for GraphQL client. Yeah, yep. Okay, so it doesn't look like there's any real issues here, so this should definitely work. Oh boy. Could not find declare repository providing the artifacts. Oh. That's new. Also, oh, maybe there's a new, maybe there's probably a bunch of new versions for like a bunch of stuff. Okay. This is JDBC Hikari. So this is now 2.2.6. What else were you complaining about? Flyway, JDBI. Oh, why didn't it find that? That's silly. Oh boy. io dot Micronaut dot Micronaut JDBI. Oh boy. All right, let's try this again. Yo, man, why can't you find this? Seriously? Oh, it's got a new maven group. So what does that mean? Micronaut.sql now? That's why. Flyway. This is probably also SQL now. No. IO Micronaut Flyway. Okay, so yeah, they've changed a bunch of stuff. All right, price you pay for being an early adopter. Okay. Yes, there we go. Okay, so this is graphical. Our schema is being parsed. It hit our breakpoint. It ran through. It errored out. No scalar implementation for decimal. Oh, okay, yeah. All right, so it is complaining because we have a type decimal, which we're going to comment that out for now because we're going to take this one step at a time. So we will comment this out and then we will not use value decimal. We'll restart this. I want to take this one at a time. So first we're going to do a query, then we're going to do this. So you will notice if I open up the docs thing here, you'll see we have query, and this is kind of where you start to get kind of built-in documentation. So again, this is a live kind of API query explorer, which is pretty cool. it shows all the fields, it shows you the different types. You can add comments. So if I add something here, this represents a single banking transaction, right? This represents a given account. We will get rid of this. So if we rerun this, we'll basically see this documentation. We'll put it in a couple different more spots, but you can put documentation in your schema and it will show up in your documentation browser. Query, so these are all the queries available to you. Account, this will also represents a given account, right? So it's basically reading everything up until here. Okay, so now we can talk a little bit about GraphQL. So in order to send a query, you start with query. And the cool thing about this is that you get autocomplete based on all of the types. So whenever you send this, you can pick just the fields that you want back. And if I run this, again, it's just going to run that function and I should get empty list, right? So we will definitely get into more details about GraphQL, but we'll do a couple things here. So let's talk about this a little bit. So GraphQL is basically a schema and query language for your API. And we'll go a little bit deeper on this, and I encourage you to go through this introduction, this website to GraphQL. Essentially, what's really nice about it is that it inverts control back to the client, so that the client can decide exactly what it needs, field by field, query by query, and get exactly what it needs, nothing that it doesn't. And by defining the query, the response also follows that shape, which is pretty cool. So, for example, now let's start to add in some data. So let's return, a list of, and let's do an account. So what does an account have? It's got an ID, name, and a description, right? So one, savings, this is my, right? We could do another account. And this will be the checking account. Okay. And if we run this, we will now get our accounts back. Great. 1, 2. And so again, like I was saying, the GraphQL, the client is in full control of what gets returned from the server, and the response mimics what comes back. So if I don't want the description, I don't have to ask for it, and it doesn't come back in the response. I can also rename fields if I wanted to. So if I don't like what any of these are called, I can rename it, and it will come back as that. So it allows me to transform the information coming back as well, which is really cool. So with this in place, this is really what I wanted to get to. So what did we do? So we got our GraphQL testing set up working, and let's just make sure we didn't break anything here. we will run our tests, but we shouldn't have broken anything. So we fixed our containerized testing setup that runs all of our integration tests in isolation. We then upgraded to the latest and greatest version of Micronaut. And then we started to actually start to wire in or build our API with GraphQL. We created a single endpoint, or single GraphQL endpoint that allows us to start to query for things. And there we go, our test just passed. And we started looking into this tool called Graphical, which is a query browser that you can kind of turn on and enable. And so whenever your server is running, you turn this on and you can go to the /graphical endpoint and you can browse the entire API surface, if you will, of your GraphQL API. So this is pretty cool. And this is where, you know, I really like GraphQL, particularly for this, right? The challenges of maintaining API documentation with code and all of those things can be tricky. And this really kind of brings a lot of it closer together. So as I said again, right, part of GraphQL is you're creating a schema for your API. You're defining your types, you're defining your queries or your entry points, and then people can choose what information to get and how to grab it back and what shape it comes back in to suit their needs. And you can do inline information and documentation, and then, you know, graphical, and there's a couple other different types of things similar to GraphQL, you know, makes this nice query browser. So if you are someone coming to, you know, a new service or a new API, this Explorer really kind of helps you get familiar with and understand and walk around what you can grab. So I've really become a big fan and big proponent of this from an API perspective. I really like it. So that's all I think for the stream tonight. We made a lot of good progress, and in the next stream we'll continue to kind of work on these GraphQL APIs. We'll start to write some tests for the GraphQL APIs, right? Make our test suite more robust, our integration test suite, and then probably start getting into some more database stuff next. So that's about it for tonight.